Without further ado, let's talk about the Timucua. Right. So as Lisa mentioned, right, I work for the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse. I'm the registrar and assistant curator over there, which means that I deal with the history of pretty much every aspect of Volusia County, right? Principally the lighthouse, of course, but that involves so much more than just the lighthouse. Pretty much anything around our lighthouse, I'm also involved with. And so recently, as she mentioned, in February, we had our first Indigenous Heritage Day to celebrate the Native peoples that lived on the land where our lighthouse now is and where our county now is. And that happens to be my specialty, if you will. I have a master's degree in history, specifically focused on Florida history, and then even more specifically focused on Native American history in Florida. So it's a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. So they asked me to write an article for our quarterly newsletter about the Timucua and about the Native history of our county. So I did, and I believe you guys should have that in person there. Anybody in person, I think, should have access to that article there. If not, I think Lisa can give you one. So that article, I think, is pretty great. I mean, I wrote it, but it has most of what I'm about to cover, probably a bit more, goes into a bit more detail, a lot more depth. So please feel free to take that home. And if you have any questions, I think my email is at the end. Feel free to send them to me. But yeah, so let's talk about the Timucua, right? The first question people typically have, right, is it the Timucua? Is it Timucua? Is it Timucua? And the way that I like to start off the presentations by saying that they're all varying shades of incorrect, right? And we'll get to that in a minute. But let me now attempt to share my screen. So I have the PowerPoint presentation over here. I'm sharing it now. It should be full screen. If I swap the views, I believe everything should be good to go. Feel free to interrupt me if it's not looking. I think it should be good, right? The Timucua of Northeast Florida, presented by the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse Preservation Association. There's my email at the bottom. So let's continue on just very briefly, just so you have something to look at instead of just me. You can see some of these images that we're going to talk about. So for starters, there's our beautiful lighthouse. I'm sure you guys have seen it. It's just across the inlet from you guys. And to the right is something that made me want to write that article in the first place and made us want to do our Indigenous Heritage Day in the first place. It's a site called Green Mound. So that's an old picture from, I want to say, the 50s of some anthropologists and archaeologists investigating Green Mound, which is a shell midden in Ponce Inlet, just a couple miles away from the lighthouse, right? Just maybe like 2 miles north of our light station. So clearly there was some native activity, indigenous activity in Ponce Inlet and throughout the surrounding areas as well. So that's one of the reasons why we ended up writing the article and continuing on with this subject of Native history, right? Why aren't you guys talking about the lighthouse? And so we'll get to that. Here's another site, another shell midden that's a bit closer to you guys over here in New Smyrna. This is Turtle Mound. So on the left, right, top left, you have a photograph of it from the early 1900s. And then on the bottom right, you have a modern photograph of it. Turtle Mound is another shell midden over there or in Canaveral National Seashore. It is the largest remaining shell midden in the state of Florida. We'll get into shell middens in a little bit. So there's Turtle Mound right there. So the Timucua, who are the Timucua that we're talking about? They were the native groups of peoples that lived in this area. So over here on the left, you can see a map of where they pretty much used to live. It's very hard to find an actual accurate map of this. I've scoured through many books and Google searches and online websites trying to find a decent map. And it's very difficult because they're all kind of varied in what they show. They all have different names and they all have their slight issues. So this is, I think, one of the better ones that roughly shows the area where the Timucua would have lived. So it gives you a good scope, a good frame of reference for what I'm talking about when I talk about the Timucua. These were the native groups of people that lived in present-day Volusia County, all the way down to like close to Orlando in the center of the state, and then almost to Tallahassee, right around the like center of the Panhandle before you get to the actual Panhandle. So pretty much this whole northeastern part of Florida used to be inhabited by the Timucua tribe. To the right over here, you have a graphical representation of the Timucua, because of course there's no photograph of them, which we'll also get to in a little bit. I believe next one, yeah, so here's just some more. So I'll leave this one on for a while. So the Timucua, it might help to, or actually I'll go back one just so I can still have the map up there. I've been told that it helps to give a brief timeline in order to just get people situated into the grand scope of native Florida history. Because when I talk about Native Americans in Florida, typically the first group that comes to people's minds is what? It's the Seminoles, right? If somebody asks you who are the Native Americans of Florida, typically what's going to come to mind for 99% of people is going to be the Seminoles, and that's true. They are the current the main Native American group here in the state of Florida. It's a Seminole tribe of Florida. There's also the Miccosukee, which share a similar history to the Seminoles, but are distinct. But the Seminoles kind of sort of came a bit later. Before the Seminoles, you have various groups, right? Or you had various groups in Florida. This was during the time of European colonization in Florida. So beginning in the 1500s, right? Juan Ponce de Leon, the famous Spanish conquistador, where we actually get the name of our inlet from, Ponce de Leon Inlet. He discovered Florida, right, with quotation marks. He discovered Florida in 1513. So that pretty much begins the period of European colonization of Florida. So from the 1500s to about the 1700s, when you start getting the Seminoles coming down, that's when we're talking about the Timucua. We have the Timucua, you have various other groups in Florida, like the Tocobaga, just to the south over here by the like armpit of Florida on the Gulf Coast. You have the Ais that are a bit south of us by Canaveral. You had the Calusa that are down in the like the Tampa area. You had the Tequesta down where Miami is. You had the Miami people close to Lake Okeechobee. You had a bunch of different groups of people. They're various different tribes, and they all shared similarities, but all had slight differences as well. Some were allied to each other, others hated each other's guts and rivals to one another. So it's hard to lump them all together into one cohesive group. And then before the period of European colonization, before the 1500s, there were native peoples in Florida, right? The descendants of these named groups like the Timucua and Calusa and Tequesta, Tocobaga and stuff. There were plenty of people in Florida. We just don't exactly have names for them because they didn't really survive to tell their heritage, right? These were the ancestors of the named groups, the Timucua and stuff, and human habitation in Florida can be traced all the way back to one of the last ice ages, so about like 15,000 years ago, or actually 15 BCE, so it'd be like 17,000 years ago. Human beings started migrating their way into like the northern Florida area, and then throughout the next couple thousand years, they started migrating a bit further south until they got to the South Florida area. So this would be a period when Florida was much larger than what it currently is, because sea levels were a lot lower. There was a lot more ice trapped in the poles of the earth, so Florida was much more massive, about double the size actually. And so you had all these prehistoric game animals in Florida, like mammoths and mastodons and big saber-toothed cats and all sorts of stuff like that. And even other random stuff like the California condor, which no longer is around in Florida, but is in California. There used to be some of that here too. There were some Paleolithic horses that existed in Florida, not the same horses that were brought over from the Europeans, but there was a breed of horses that lived in Florida way, way back in the day. And of course, all of these can be found in archaeological records. So it's not just conjecture. We have fossil records of all these different types of animals throughout the state. So those are the three main periods of natives that I'll really talk about. There's the pre-named stuff before the European colonization that we don't really have names for the individual groups. Those groups are more divided by time period. Archaeologists really try to define them based on like the Everglades period, the Everglades II period, the St. John's period, the such and such period, right? It's based on when they lived. And so you'll see differences in like pottery and differences in the tools they used, right? Slight differences, very technical stuff. And then you start getting a lot of information when you get to that named period, because now we have European colonization. So you have a lot of European records, which we'll get into in a minute. So it's mainly the Spanish and the French were the two main colonial powers in Florida. Later, the British, but by that point, there weren't too many natives left in Florida. At the time when the Europeans first arrived in Florida, it was estimated that Florida had, and it's hard to estimate, but some of the books by very well-renowned historians that I've read estimate anywhere from a few 100,000 to under 1 million people in Florida. I think it's probably closer to a couple 100,000. I don't think it got to 1 million, but let's say between 100,000 and 300,000 people in the state of Florida scattered throughout the peninsula. And they were scattered in these various small, kind of like cities, but not really cities, more like little chiefdoms, little clans, similar to how Europe was at the time, just on a slightly less populous scale, right? So Europe at the time in the 1500s had many different city-states and cities. If you think of like the Holy Roman Empire, where today is Germany, and at the time there were many, many hundreds or dozens of little cities, and some of them were allied to each other. Some of them hated each other's guts. Some of them traded with each other. They were very similar in certain regards, but different in other regards, right? And so whereas today we might look at them and say, oh, they're all pretty much Germans, right? You know, go back 500 years and call somebody from Hanover, you know, a Bavarian, or call somebody from Mainz, you know, Prussian, and it, you know, might cause issues. So that's kind of how it was in Florida, right? So the term Timucua, I started this off by talking about, is it Timucua, Timucua? They're all pretty much wrong, because in reality, it wasn't one specific group. It wasn't one large group that we would think of as like, these are the Timucuans, right? In reality, it was more like 13, 14, maybe 15 different small tribal chieftains. And those different groups together got this umbrella term of Timucua, right? So if I go on to the next slide right here, we can start talking about some of that European colonization stuff, right? So over here, the main chief that you see right on the, just to the right of the center, that's supposed to be Chief Saturiwa. And then to the right of him, you have some French explorers. So what happened was in the 1560s, the French came to Florida, to North Florida specifically, and they tried to, not all the French, but it was a group of Huguenots that it was a Protestant sect, and they were trying to escape persecution in France. France was very Catholic at the time, so they were trying to find some land for themselves. Florida was perfect because nobody really wanted Florida at that time. So they came to Florida, they scouted out this land over here, met with some of the Timucuans, and eventually came back and tried to establish a colony here, which the Spanish then destroyed. But during their time here, where they encountered the Timucua, they met with this chief Saturiwa right here, right? That was the chief's name. He was chief of the saltwater peoples, right? Remember I said how the Timucua was really a grouping of various different tribes that together made up the Timucua. The saltwater peoples was one of those little tribes. So Chief Saturiwa of the saltwater peoples called the chief of the freshwater peoples, right? So the saltwater peoples lived just north of us, around closer to like the St. Augustine area. And then you have the freshwater peoples that lived right here in Volusia County, right along the East Coast. So this Chief Saturiwa of the saltwater peoples called the chief of the freshwater peoples, his name was Chief Utina. Chief Saturiwa called Chief Utina a Timugonia, right? What does a Timugonia mean? We don't know. Nobody knows, right? It was never recorded. So this Chief Saturiwa called this Chief Utina a Timugonia, right? So it could have been anything. It could have been, you know, a term of reference, or he could have just been insulting that guy. He could have just been calling him, oh, that guy, or it could be a lot more colorful than that. But one way or the other, he called them a Timugonia. And then about 30 years later, when the Spanish were in town, the Spanish were now in control of Florida, they had met with this other group of peoples over on the closer to the St. John's area, right? So not the saltwater peoples, not the freshwater peoples over here in Volusia County, but closer to the St. John's. They met with this group called the Utina, right? Happened to have the same name as the chief of the freshwater peoples. So they called them, they remembered some French writing that said, no, Utina was a Timugonia. And so they called this unrelated group over by the St. John's that had nothing to do with the saltwater and freshwater peoples. They started calling them Timugonias, right? And then because they all spoke a similar language, suddenly everybody got lumped together and they're all Timugonias. And that Timugonias is how we get the term Timucua, right? So we don't even know what it means, right? It could be extremely offensive or it could be, you know, completely mundane. But that's how we get the term Timucua or Timucua or Timucua. So that's why I like to say that they're all pretty much different shades of wrong, right? They're all pretty much inaccurate, but that's the name that stuck. That's the umbrella term that got applied to all these groups, and that's just how we refer to them today because it's convenient, right? What happened to the Timucua, right? Why don't they correct this today? The Timucua, as well as most of the groups in Florida, pretty much all the groups that were truly native to Florida, were wiped out due to various diseases that the Europeans brought over, mainly smallpox, but lots of other flus and illnesses too, like malaria, lots of stuff. So it's estimated that about 90 to 95% of the native population of the Americas, not just Florida, but the entire Americas, 90 to 95% of the population was wiped out because of various diseases. And that's a crazy number, 90 to 95, right? So Florida, from the 1500s when first contact was made to about the 1700s was just declining in population. And then in the 1700s, that's when you start getting these runaways from the north, from the like Georgia, South Carolina area. They were Creek Indians, Muskogee Indians. They were escaping the Americans and British up north. And so some of them fled down south into Florida, and those eventually became Seminoles, right? And so they did intermarry and group up with some of the very few surviving tribes in Florida. But that's how we get the Seminoles here in Florida. And then through a series of Seminole wars in the 1800s, the American Army pushed the Seminoles further and further and further south to where they are today, which is in pretty much the Everglades, right? All the way down in South Florida. So from the Georgia area all the way down south. So going forward over here on the slides, we have a couple other pictures images, engravings or drawings of the Timucua, which we'll actually talk about right now. So here's again, Chief Saturiwa. You can actually see his name in between his legs. So he's holding, I believe, a conch shell or just some other type of shell, and he's heavily tattooed. Here we have another engraving of some native Timucuan people in a canoe, right? So this all seems pretty accurate other than the mountains in the background. I don't know what mountains we have in Florida. I guess they could be different hills or shell middens or something like that, but they look awfully big. Here we have some of their diet. You can see they ate pretty much anything. What I like to say is that if it swam in the water, it was part of their diet, right? So everything from snakes and small animals and large game animals, but mainly anything that came from the water. So any species of fish, you had manatees and dolphins and whales and even seals that a lot of people didn't know there were seals in Florida, but even the Caribbean monk seal, which only went extinct in like the 1950s. You can bet that they ate them. Birds, right? All the many, many different types of wading birds that we have in Florida were all part of the Timucuan diet. So here's just a depiction of that. Deer, of course, was a big part, lots of deer around. And then, yeah, so this is Fort Carolyn. This is the original little settlement that the French made. There's the French flag over there on the left side, bottom left side. So what are these images that we're looking at? I love talking about these images because I guarantee you've seen these before, right? If you've been to a museum in Florida that talks about Florida history, I guarantee you've seen some of these before, right? I'll keep scrolling through these. You'll see a couple more. So for sure, you've seen some of these. If you haven't, go to any museum in Florida, and I guarantee you'll see some of these. We have some of these at the Lighthouse. I've seen some of these in museums in Tallahassee, museums down in Miami, museums in Tampa, Orlando, pretty much everywhere for a couple different reasons, right? So what are these and why are they so ubiquitous in Florida history? These are, they go by two different names. They're either called the Lemoyne drawings or the de Vries engravings, right? So Jacques Lemoyne was one of those Frenchmen that came to Florida to build this settlement over here, Fort Carolyn, right? So he was an artist. He drew a lot of what he saw and recorded a lot of it in his journal. So Jacques Lemoyne is where one of the names comes from, the Lemoyne drawings, because it's believed that some of them were drawings that he did. And, you know, he was one of the first Europeans to really see Florida and meet the Timucuans. And then the other name, the de Vries engravings, comes from a man named Theodore de Vries, or de Vries. He was a slightly different figure, right? So Lemoyne came to Florida, actually saw some of this stuff, drew some of this stuff out, went back to France, was still persecuted in France for being a Huguenot. So he fled to London. And while he was in London, he eventually sold his journal, or possibly his wife sold it after he passed away. His widow sold it. But eventually it makes its way to the hands of this guy named Theodore de Vries. And de Vries had never stepped foot in America, right? Never stepped foot in Florida. He had never been to Florida. He did not meet the Timucua. But he took some of these stories that he read about in Lemoyne's journals and possibly some of the images, and he made these various engravings, which is what you're seeing now, right? Because this is before, you know, copy paste. So they would basically engrave these images onto maybe like a block of wood or a block of stone, and then you could use that, put ink on it, and then mass produce these, print out a lot of copies of these. And so these are the de Vries engravings. And so because they were made so long ago, right, in the late 1500s, early 1600s, they're free to use, right? There's no copyright claim on them. And so, and there's really no alternatives, right? Like I said, the Timucuans aren't around anymore, right? So you can't just get photographs of them as you would for, say, the Seminoles, right? If you want to depict the Seminoles, there are photographs of them today. There are photographs of them from 100 years ago interacting with various of the pioneers of Florida, right? Various trading posts throughout the Everglades, throughout the center of the state, all the way down. So you have lots of images available of the Seminoles, historic ones from the late 1800s, early 1900s, all the way to modern day. But these de Vries engravings, which I see here, somebody had a question about when were these images made. These were made in the late 1500s, early 1600s, and they were made to be mass produced and sold to a European audience that had never heard of or seen or definitely not been to Florida. So if you imagine them as that, think of that context for them, right? These aren't historically, what we're finding out now, we being the historic world, the historians of today, we're learning that these aren't really 100% accurate, right? And little by little, we're learning why these aren't 100% accurate. And today it's estimated that I think only one of the drawings was actually done by Lemoyne, who had come to Florida, and the rest weren't were just either completely made up or just very embellished in some way by DeVry. So I'm going to show some of these very inaccurate drawings right now. And if you have the article that I wrote in front of you in your hand there, if you're watching this in person, a lot of these should be on there. So feel free to look at them on the screen or open them up. And I'm pretty sure most of these should be on there. So I'm just going to show a couple of them. This one's a classic one. There is an alligator over here, right? It shows the Timucuan men hunting an alligator, 2 alligators really. First of all, the alligator is massive, right? That gator looks like it's like 30 feet tall, right, compared to the size of the people. But also, if you look at the details of this alligator, it's clearly done by somebody who's never seen an alligator, right? This alligator, if you look at its eyes, it's got very human-like eyes. It's got very human-like protruding ears. It has long, skinny fingers coming off its arms. It's very muscular arms, right? Very strange looking alligator for anybody who's actually ever seen an alligator. So yeah, that's clearly done by somebody who's never been to Florida. Over here, you have supposedly a Timucuan village. However, there's no evidence whatsoever in the world of archaeology. There's no evidence to support any sort of wooden wall around the village or a palisade, as that looks like. There's no evidence of that anywhere. So the huts themselves do look fairly consistent with what we find. We find the post holes for where the house would have been, and they do look to be about that size and about that shape. And, you know, thatched roof is pretty common in the Florida with all the palm trees that we have. But there's no evidence of a wooden palisade anywhere, right? So why would he embellish that? Why would he put a wooden palisade? It's because that's what they had in Europe at the time, right? So here's a European man, I believe he was Dutch, living in London, drawing about Florida. And so he draws this little village, and then, oh, well, clearly they must have a wall around it, right? We have walls around all our cities over here in Europe, right? So let me put a little wall around it. Here's a good one. This is a large pitch battle in the state of Florida, right? This is one of those like spot the errors in this image, right? So first of all, if you look at this image, you can see mountains in the background, right? So clearly not Florida, right? It's supposed to be depicting Florida, but I mean, it's a whole mountain range. It's not even like one hill. It's a mountain range in the background. Secondly, it is a very large open field, and you have massive amounts of people on either side, right? Remember I said that the state of Florida, or the peninsula of Florida, wasn't a state at the time. At the time of European colonization, only had 100,000, maybe 300,000, and they were in very small little villages here and there, right? There was no population to have giant pitch battles like this, right? So again, this is something that you see in Europe, right? Europe had the population to support these massive open battles with, you know, pitch warfare and square units and stuff. This is not at all how wars were fought in Florida. It was mainly small skirmishes and raids. One group would go to another village and, you know, raid them just after sunrise or just before sundown. They would steal some supplies, kill a few people, take, you know, anything they might need, even some captives, and then, you know, escape quickly. It was nothing at all like this massive, you know, Game of Thrones like battle that you see here, completely fictional, right? This one's my favorite. I love this one. This because I'm a big Led Zeppelin fan, and I think these guys look a lot like Robert Plant, or a bit like Isaac Newton. These are supposed to be Timucuan men carrying off their wounded after battle, right? And these look like very Renaissance figure-looking dudes. So again, very applying European aesthetics to these Timucuan engravings. This one is ridiculous. This one is panning for gold in the state of Florida, right? When was the last time you saw gold anywhere in the state of Florida, right? When was the last time you found gold in a river in the state of Florida, right? It doesn't happen because there is no gold in the state of Florida, right? We know that now, and the natives knew that, right? The Timucuan knew that because they've never seen gold. Why would they look for gold if there was never any gold in Florida? They've never seen gold in Florida. Why would they be looking for gold? But De Vries knew that Europeans were looking for gold anywhere they can find in the New World, right? They were, must be looking for gold. So if the Europeans are looking for gold, then clearly the natives must be looking for gold too, right? So here's a depiction of everyday life in Florida showing the natives depicting or panning for gold, right? Something that never happened in Florida, right? This looked more like a scene you'd see out west in like California or something, but yeah, completely fictional, right? Here's another, this one gets into the heart of the whole issue, right? Because people typically ask, okay, why? Why is he embellishing this? Why were these images made? Why are they so inaccurate, right? Why do they show weird alligators and panning for gold and large pitch battle stuff that never happened or was completely embellished, or, what's the point, right? Again, these pictures were made to be mass produced, right? He was selling these pictures to a European audience, right? A European audience who had clearly never been to Florida, right? The vast majority of people in Europe had never been to Florida. A lot of them hadn't even heard of Florida, and never will go to Florida, right? So these people are hearing about this from these images, or reading about this from these images and reading about it in their newspapers where these would have appeared. And so they're sensationalized, right? The same way that nowadays you have social media and lots of clickbaity news titles about how you can lose 50 pounds of weight and whatever, and how, oh, you won't believe what's going on and blah, 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 right? And it's the same thing in the late 1500s, early 1600s. You have, so this is like the pinnacle of that. It's depicting sacrificing of children and babies and whatever, right? Because what's going to sell newspapers in Europe, right? It's going to be sensationalism, right? So are you going to write about the intricacies of Timucuan pottery and the different categories of Timucuan tribes and the hierarchical system by which these tribes adhere? No, you're not going to do any of that, right? You're going to talk about, oh my God, look how they're sacrificing their babies before battle, and wow, look at them, they have tattoos from head to toe, look how crazy these people are, right? So these are all the embellishments that were added in order to sell newspapers, right? This was like the paparazzi of the day, if the paparazzi could just invent stuff out of thin air. And we now know that these are mostly inaccurate. So then that begs the other question, right? Why are museums still using this if they're very inaccurate? Why am I showing you these if they're mostly inaccurate? And again, the reason is that this is very new research. We're now learning, right, in the past 10, 20 years, history of, right, it's called the historiography of Florida. The research of history in the state is improving, and we're learning about these things, and people are starting to ask questions about, maybe, if this image is inaccurate, what about this image over here that we've always assumed is correct? Maybe this one's got some problems too. And as new archaeological records are found, we're starting to be able to vet some of these engravings. And so that's why it's believed that pretty much all of these were either invented by De Vries or heavily embellished by De Vries. And it's estimated that only one of these, like 15 to 20 or so engravings, was actually drawn by Lemoyne, who did come to Florida, did interact with the Timucua. So that's a shame. All right. I don't think I have any other questions about that, so I'm going to continue on. I think that's all the images I have to show. So I'll go back to one of them, and then I want to talk about shell middens for a second, right? Because I'm talking to people at the Marine Discovery Center. I've been talking a lot about history so far, but I figured let me talk a little bit about some of the environments and some of the plants and animals over here, stuff that I think is fascinating. So if you'll just bear with me for 2 seconds as I head back right here. So we have, this is Turtle Mound. So this previous image is Green Mound over here on the right, and then you have Turtle Mound, which is in New Smyrna. So Green Mound in Ponce Inlet, Turtle Mound in New Smyrna. Apologies. So these are what's called shell middens, right? So you may have heard of the term, you may not have heard of the term. Shell middens are essentially, they're big trash heaps, right? That's the way that a lot of people like to describe them. They are shell mounds, right? So it's essentially a big mound comprised mainly of shells, and they are built over generation after generation after generation, right? So the state of Florida currently has a few of these. I mean, there's lots of these remaining, but not very many large ones. So Turtle Mound is actually the largest remaining one. It's believed to be the largest one ever, and it's still actually remarkably well preserved because it's on the National Canaveral seashore. So it's a national park, right? So that's why it's well preserved. A lot of these, right? Florida used to have a lot more of these, and it's unfortunate that not very many of them survive. Right. And when I say that, I mean really not very many of them at all compared to what the whole state, the East Coast, the West Coast, the inland of the state with all the many waterways, anywhere that there's water, there would have been some of these shell middens. And it's unfortunate that the vast majority of them do not survive till this day. So what are they and why don't they survive? So as I said, the big mounds of shells. Think of yourself as a Timucuan in charge of getting food for his or her tribe, right? If you have to go and collect a lot of oyster shells, for example, which is one of the main shells used in a lot of these shell middens, you go somewhere, you go from your village to somewhere along the coast and say the Halifax River or the Indian River, you collect all these many oysters that are extremely abundant, right? Food was extremely abundant in the state of Florida or peninsula of Florida. You had lots and lots of life everywhere. So there was really no need to farm because there's just so much food abundant everywhere. It's actually one of the pretty amazing in the anthropological world that the natives down in South Florida, like the Calusa and Tequesta, they actually didn't have any form of agriculture at all, right? Which is a very surprising thing in the anthropological world, because that's one of like the first things that humans developed, right? In the, in order to become a civilization, that's like, step one on the table. And yet here in Florida is one of the few places in the world where we had civilizations, right? That were technically considered civilizations or complex civilizations that didn't have any form of agriculture whatsoever. So in North Florida, there was a little bit of agriculture, but South Florida just didn't even need to, just because of how abundant the food was, right? Again, all the stuff that came from the ocean. So not just all the wading birds that we had, but lots of fish too. So like mullet especially was one of the big ones. Tons and tons of mullet allowed them to not really need to farm their crops, right? You can gather forage for plants and eat what you can off the land, but then in terms of abundance of life, you can easily catch whatever you needed. So you go out to get oysters, you get a ton of oysters. Are you going to take all these oysters in their shells and everything? You're going to take that back to your village? You could, but that would exert a lot more energy. It would take a lot more time. It would be physically a lot heavier. So it just doesn't really make sense to do that. So what do? You shuck the oysters right then and there, right? Throw away the majority of it, or the heavier part of it, which is the shells. And you collect the actual oyster meat, and that's the part that you take home, right? And so you do that every day for a while. You do that all constantly, right? You, and then your kid, and then the kid's kid, and then 3 generations later, everybody does that in the same area. Eventually, these shells pile up, and you end up with these shell middens, right? So it's the discarded shell, the discarded shells of countless generations of human inhabitants in that area, right? So that's why it's typically shells, because that's the waste product, right? You would eat the actual critter that's found in the shell, and you would discard the oyster shells or coquina shells or clam shells, right? All different types of shells, right? Each shell midden has its own specific composition. So like Green Mound is like 55% oyster shells and 10% coquina shell and 20% this and whatever. They're all slightly different. One of the coolest things that I've learned actually very recently about shell middens that I think is fascinating, and I think you guys will love there at the Marine Discovery Center, is that shell middens, when compared to the rest of the state, right, so the rest of the open, undeveloped area in the state, shell middens have some of the highest rates, or not some of these, right, they have the highest rate of native to non-native species of plants. right? So I thought this was fascinating. If you take some random undeveloped land in Florida, which some researchers did, they took, I believe it was a park down close to Miami, and you just take this natural park and you count all the different species of plants that are found in that forest or estuary or whatever environment it is. Typically, you'll see something around like 20% non-native species and then about 80% native species, right? Not the actual bulk of the species, but just the number of species. In shell middens like these over here, like the Green Mound and Ponce Inlet, Turtle Mound down in Canaveral. There's a couple others in the state. There's, or well, in the county. I mean, there's one by Timucua State Park. There's a couple others by Ormond, I believe. There's a few more towards the north of the state. There's a few over in the St. John's by like the Pontoon Island and DeLand and some of those areas. So if you look at some of these, it's estimated that between 90 to 95, or sorry, 95 to 99% of the species are native, right? And a lot of these, only one non-native species was found, and it was Brazilian pepper, which is funny because I saw on Marine Discovery Center's Facebook, there was a post very recent, I think like a couple days ago, about Brazilian pepper and how invasive it is and everything. And so in Green Mound and Turtle Mound, there would be something like 80, 85 different species of plants, and only one of those, right? Maybe one or two others, but for the most part, it'd be just one species of invasive plants. So why is that, right? Why are these such hotbeds for native plant species as opposed to invasive plant species? So because I thought that was interesting, right? So what's the reason behind that? So I kept reading into various botanical reports, which is a bit outside of my wheelhouse, but right, because I deal with the history of stuff, but I thought it was interesting enough, so I wanted to share with you guys. The soil of these shell middens naturally is made from a lot of shells, right? These shell middens are hundreds of years of human inhabitation, so they've got tons and tons of shells in them. So the soil level is primarily shells, right? And shells are made of a different material than normal soil that you would have somewhere else. And so these shells have different thermal properties compared to soil in other places, right? If you go into your backyard and you look at your soil, it's going to have a different properties than the soil found in a shell midden. So it's estimated that these shells are better at retaining heat in the summer, and they're also better at expelling heat in the winter, right? So what does that mean? That means that in the summer, when it gets hot, these shells get even hotter, right? Just a little bit hotter than the surrounding soil outside. And then during the winter, these shells get even cooler, right? So they get the highest highs and the lowest lows compared to other soil types in the state of Florida. So what that does is that serves to weed out a lot of invasive species that maybe can handle the cold, but they can't handle the heat, or they can handle the heat, but they can't handle the cold. So you have only the true Florida plants that can survive both those extra, hot days and those extra cool days, that can thrive in these shell middens. So very fascinating information, I thought, right? So shell middens, very cool, very native, right? Very indigenous to Florida history, and they also have lots of native plants in them. It's a great place to find everything from live oaks to mangroves if they're by the water to, anything. And then where are they today, right? Why am I talking about a select few of them? And I mentioned that there were dozens, if not hundreds, throughout the state of Florida. So why aren't they around today? Florida, throughout the late 1800s and then early 1900s, Florida went through a big boom in population, right? Florida previously was a territory, and then it became a state. And then in the late 1800s, you start getting the period after the Civil War, you start getting the Reconstruction area. That's when the railroads start coming down into Florida. Yeah, everybody knows Henry Flagler's Railroad, the Florida East Coast Railroad, and you have others, the West Coast Railroad, and you have a Central Railroad. There's lots of different railroads that are coming to Florida, which Goes into a lot more about like the steamboat business and how the railroads killed off the steamboats or whatever. But basically, as these railroads are being built, you need fill material, right, in order to level out the land, right? And what better fill material than crushed shells that are, ever so abundant in the state? You have a perfectly, round mound of shells right next to where you want to build a railroad. Use them, right? So they started using them in railroad construction in the late 1800s, and then early 1900s, start getting more roads built. So they, again, perfect substrate material to put your asphalt over. And then you have World War II in the 1940s. And then after World War II, there's a big push to improve the highway system in the United States under President Eisenhower, I believe it was, the something Highway Act, where you get a lot of these interstates built, like I-5 or I-95 or I-40. And so a lot of these interstates, again, used a lot of fill material. And so you have these perfect mounds of shells, just ready to go right next to where you need to build these highways. So a lot of them were used as fill material for these highways. And then luckily now we know better than to do that. So a lot of these mounds are either in protected areas like Canaveral Seashore, right, with Turtle Mound, or some others like Green Mound and Ponce Inlet has become I think it's placed on the National Register of Historic Places. So if you've been to Ponce Inlet, it's a little place called Ponce Preserve. I drive by it every single day on the way to work. It's hard to see because you just see, it looks like a forest, right? It's not super pronounceable. It's not a very obvious hill or anything like that, but that's because it's lost about 75% of its shell material. So if you look at over here on the Green Mound to the right, you'll see the stratification of shells. That's really the key feature of these shell middens, is just how many layers of shell. It's not just a pile of shell, it's a continued human inhabitation of shell after shell after shell after shell after shell. It's not soil and then shell on top, it's just tons and tons of stacked shells. Some people ask, okay, are these burial mounds, right? Like, ooh, Native American burial mounds? That's a question I've gotten quite a few times. Short answer is not really. There are a couple of mounds more inland, not a lot, but there's a couple that were indeed burial mounds, and those are extremely obvious that they were burial mounds because those had, lots of human remains have been found in them, and so those are typically much smaller. That's not similar to the ones that we're talking about here. Those are more, it's like a cemetery type site. These shell middens that I'm talking about, like Green Mound, which unfortunately has lost most of its size, and Turtle Mound, which is still the biggest one in the state, these are not burial mounds by any means. These are just points of prolonged human inhabitation. So when were these made? It's another common question. Both of these, Green Mound and Turtle Mound, were made between around 800 AD and 1100 AD, right? So you'll see that's about 300 years-ish of human inhabitation, right? So it's not just one person or one group of people making these, over your lifetime. It's over a few different lifetimes, many generations of people combining to produce this. So Turtle Mound is actually an interesting one because as soon as Turtle Mound ends, or you stop seeing stratification on Turtle Mound, there's a mound south of that, so further south, closer to Canaveral, that where you start seeing it. So from about 800 to 1100, you have Turtle Mound being formed, and then from about 1100 to I believe like the 1300s, you have another mound further south. Those are much smaller, so it indicates that it maybe was a smaller number of people that were there, or maybe it just wasn't as productive. There weren't as many oysters and shells and stuff in that area. Who knows? It's a bit difficult. These shell middens, they're cool to look at. They're great for the state because they have lots of native plant species and everything like that. But from an archaeological perspective, they are super valuable because of this prolonged period of human inhabitation, right? They show so much They give us such a good glimpse into the history of the state and the history of the people that lived here. So there's been various archaeological excavations, not digs, but excavations done in the in some of these shell middens, like Green Mound. You can see here, this one done in the 50s, that goes as far as they can to try and find what human beings ate in Florida and how they lived in Florida, and all these fascinating things that we can learn just by seeing the things that are found in shell middens. So I believe that covers the majority of it. Let me think. We've talked about the Timucua. We've talked about the shell middens. We've talked about various of these engravings, talked a bit about the location. There's also the Seminoles, which we mentioned a bit, came later. The Seminoles, one quick thing I'll say about the Seminoles and the Seminole, specifically about the Seminole Wars. I think it's a period of American history that's very easily and often overlooked in our state's history. When we talk about, when we're talking about American history in general, it goes straight from like the Northeast all the way to like, Manifest Destiny, and we're in California by that point. So it kind of glosses over Florida. But then even if we talk about Florida history, it kind of just starts at like the railroads in the late 1800s. So it glosses over a lot of the Seminole Wars. And so there were 3 Seminole Wars. Really, it was just one big war, various skirmishes. They happened just before the Civil War. Civil War was in the 1860s. So in the first half of the 1800s, you have basically the American Army just pushing further and further south into Florida to try and expel the Seminoles from this land. And so as they kept pushing further and further south into Florida, Florida at that point was very wild, right? It was very uncharted territory. Nobody really wanted it. It was just a land of runaways and pirates and undesirables. So the American Army started building little outposts, right? And they called them forts, but it wasn't like a massive fort like you would see in St. Augustine, the big castle there. These are just little outposts with maybe like one wooden building for the white soldiers and one wooden building for their slaves. And as they kept going further and further south, they made all these little forts. And I think it's interesting that a lot of these forts eventually went on to become cities. So if you've ever wondered why it's called Fort Myers or Fort Lauderdale, or I think Fort Pierce, or some of these other forts in the state of Florida, it's because of the Seminole Wars. Others of the forts you haven't probably never heard of, like Fort Dallas and Fort Gatling and Fort Brooks, you've probably never heard of, because those eventually went on to become cities with different names. So Fort Dallas became Miami, Fort Brooks became Tampa, Fort Gatling became Orlando. But all of these can really date back to the Seminole Wars, with the little outposts that the American Army built around the like mouths of rivers and stuff like that in order to get a better footing in the state of Florida. So speaking of some of these names, it's just fascinating stuff, right? We talked about the Timucua name. Real quick about their language. We know a decent bit about the Timucua language specifically because of Spanish missionaries who in the 1500s and 1600s were in Florida trying to convert these Timucua into Catholicism. And so some of these Spanish friars, specifically one man named Father Francisco Pareja, he decided, it's probably easier to communicate with the Timucua if we understood their language, right? So he converted the Timucua language and alphabet into a Latinized version using the Latin alphabet of like A, B, C, D, E. So because of that, we know quite a bit about the Timucua language. Very fascinating stuff. I think a little bit of that is in the article that you guys have there. But then a lot of these other groups in Florida, like the groups in the South Florida area, we just don't really know much about their language because nobody ever wrote it down. And these groups are no longer here. So it's unfortunate that we don't know much about the Calusa language or the Tequesta language or Tocobaga language or anything like that. But Timucua is pretty cool. We do know a few of their words. So the article, I think, has some of those. Some of the interesting ones, I think, are the word for water. I think it's interesting because it doesn't just mean water. I forget what the word is, but the word for water means water. It means rain. It means river. It means stream. It means ocean. So pretty much anything that involves water, they use the same word for. I thought that was pretty interesting, right? And they did that with some other words too, like grandmother is the same word, grandmother, mother, daughter. It's all the same word. It's a very interesting language, but of course not very many speakers today. So I think that mostly covers everything about the Timucua, about some of these native groups, about how they lived, about what they ate. How do you pronounce Timucua? Right, all pretty much wrong. We talked about the DeVry engravings and how inaccurate they are. Slowly, things are getting better. Museums still use them because they're free to use and easily available. You can, look for them online right now and find high quality scans of them, right? No problem. But, try and not use the ones of them panning for gold and use more of the ones that we have some historical basis out of. So yeah, thank you guys for listening to me. I hope there's people listening to me. I'm just staring at my my camera over here. Again, apologies for the last minute change to the presentation. I hope to be there in person and shake people's hands and answer questions in person. But if anybody has a question, please feel free to type it there or tell Lisa, and I guess Lisa can ask me. But that pretty much ends the presentation, unless I forgot something. But yeah, do make sure to check out the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse, because that is where I work. That is, we are committed to history, and not just our light station, but all of Volusia County. And so it involves everything from, as you saw, prehistoric times all the way to our light station that was built in 1887. There was actually another lighthouse built in New Smyrna in 1835, but that's a topic for another day. So yeah, Lisa, if anybody has any questions about anything, I would love to answer. And of course, I'd love to go do an in-person one day when I'm COVID negative. But yeah, anybody there?
I think we have a question.
Cool, yes. I cannot hear if they're asking. So
she'll ask me and I'll tell you.
Okay, yes.
So the question is, I guess, the range of the Timucuans, were they were definitely in Turtle Mound. Did they also go up to Green Mound and Ormond Beach? No. Oh no. Oh, the other way around.
So here, I can go real quick. Let me go back to this.
So the Timucuans were in the Canaveral National Seashore Range, right? Felipe?
Yeah, so pretty much, I mean, it's hard to like exactly pinpoint, because they didn't really use borders and maps in the same way that we have today, where we can look at this and say, this is Alachua County, this is Volusia County, this is Seminole County. So it's hard to exactly pinpoint it, which is why I'm telling you, if you look up like natives of Florida map, oh my, you will find all sorts of stuff, and they have like the same names here and there, and there's so many issues with a lot of them. It's very difficult to do correctly, because first, it's very limited information on this stuff, and it's just hard to figure out exactly. But it's safe to say that the Timucua, right, which again comprised of about 13, 14 different tribal units, right, is a technical term. These 13 or 14 different tribal units, including the saltwater peoples around the St. Augustine area, the freshwater peoples around here in Volusia, in the like southeast Volusia County. You had the Acuero people, the Potano peoples, you had the Utina peoples, right? Lots of these different tribes. They were everywhere from around this like southern Volusia County area all the way to like the north of the state, and then as far west as about Tallahassee. Again, it's very tricky. So this map, I think, does a decent job of explaining it, but like don't look at that and think like it's very precise and everything. It's very difficult to pinpoint exactly where the Timucua live, but suffice it to say Northeast Florida, which I think is what I called the presentation, right? Northeast Florida, yeah, right here, because I wanted to, it basically encompasses, right, Volusia County and St. Johns County and the St. Johns River and the little bit of the Panhandle, but not really, and goes kind of to the Gulf, but not really. It's just this Northeast Florida region
Okay.
is home to the Timucua, which in itself is not one group of people. It's a bunch of different groups with a bunch of different dialects. Some, like the saltwater and freshwater people, some were rivals to each other, hated each other's guts. Others were friendly, so they traded all amongst each other. So stuff like that. And then the question about did they live where this green mound was and Turtle Mound and stuff like that? Yes, but I just want to separate the time periods real quick, because again, when I'm talking about Timucua, when we mention Timucua, that immediately implies 1500s onwards, right? Because any of these named tribes, other than the Seminoles and the Miccosukee, that are modern day tribes, if we're talking about any of these named tribes like the Timucua or the various groups within them, we're talking about European colonization from the 1500s to about 1700s, maybe a little bit of the 1800s. Whereas Turtle Mound and Green Mound and a lot of these mounds were prior to that, right? So like Turtle Mound and Green Mound were 800 AD to about 1100 AD. So it kind of was the Timucuans. It was the ancestors of the Timucua, pretty much. Yes, were the ones who built or accumulated Turtle Mound and Green Mound, right? I hope that answers the questions. Are there others?
I have a question for you. I was reading a book called The Indians of Florida, I think it was. Okay. And somewhere in that it said that there actually had been there were Timucuan women chiefs. Is that, I'd never heard that before.
I am not 100% sure. I believe I've read something about that, but it's one of those things where because there are various groups of them, it's hard to like look at one thing and then apply that to all the other groups. So I think I remember reading something about that, how maybe one of the groups had a female chieftain, but it's hard to know if that was a common thing among the Timucua. It's hard to know, right? The stuff that we know about them is typically like, and I say no in a very definitive sense of the word, right? The stuff that we know for sure about the Timucua is very limited to the archaeological records, right? So stuff that we find, if we find a bone of a certain animal in this certain thing and it's got like burn marks and tool marks and stuff, then we know that they ate it, for example, right? Or if we find a specific type of pottery sherd, then we know that they did that. Or if we find like a stone that didn't originate in Florida, then we know that they must have traded from outside of the state in order to get that, right? So those are things that are more concrete in evidence. But then the stuff like that, like societal structure, their actual day-to-day life and culture, that stuff is a lot harder to really know for certain. So what we have to rely on, because you don't see that really in archaeological records, right? You don't like look at someone's bone and see, oh, this was a chieftain, right? It's really hard to know societal structure and hierarchical structure and something like that. So what we have to rely on is European records, and those are iffy and troublesome to say the least. So I feel like I remember something about them having a female chief, or one of the groups had a female chief or something, but it's hard to say exactly which one, or I'd have to do more research to see. And it's possible that we'll never know if that really applied to all of them. It's there's stuff that like we just don't know if it was one particular group that did that, or if they all did that, or maybe they did it differently, or who knows. And so the societal structure is one of those things that we don't really know, and we may never know, right? We know they had some form of societal structure, and it was often with like one chieftain commanding others. But like, for example, the exact relationship between various different groups, we kind of have to guess at based on the fact that like this group was larger and stronger and had more people and more tools and stuff. So it's probable that this group paid some sort of tribute to them, and was subservient to this group over here. But it's hard to really say these things for certain.
One other thing I think is interesting, like with the Timucuans or Timucuans, however you say it, we've heard, or you've told us that they were heavily tattooed. Is that why?
Right. Yeah, so that's one of those things that, again, it's hard to say exactly, but there are multiple European sources that mention the heavily tattooed Timucuan warriors and Timucuan chiefs. So that's something that we're pretty confident in, because there's multiple. It's not like one tiny reference to it somewhere. There are many sources that state or that mention these tattooed chieftains. However, the exact reasons for the tattoos and stuff is a little bit uncertain, or just how much they would or did all the tribes tattoo, or was it only a few of them? It's probable that most of them, if not all of them, tattooed, but like, was it limited to just the chief? Was it limited to just the warriors? That's the kind of stuff that's hard to tell, right? Exactly, like which colors were used. Some used red, but did that mean all of them used red? It's hard to know some of those exact details because skin is not very well preserved, but tattoos don't go all the way down to bone. Right. But they did have tattoos. That is something you can see in a lot of these drawings or engravings, or like this one, which I know these engravings are nothing, super. Spent the past hour talking about how terrible they are and how inaccurate they are, but that is at least one detail that we know is based off of fact, because some of those, like Jacques Lemoyne and René Laudonnière and some of the other Frenchmen who were in this area did record that, and we know they were in this area. So yeah, they did have tattoos. Right.
Anybody else have any questions? Got a question? Will you go back to the territorial map, Felipe, please?
Sure. I have a question about it.
Yeah. So good question. He's observing that it looks like it stops short of the Gulf shore on the
right. I don't know. Can you guys see my my mouse?
So the question was, is there another warring tribe in that little?
Yes, so that area over there, well, there's various different ones, but I don't know if you guys can see my mouse or not, but in that Gulf area close to Orlando, I know there was the Tocobaga tribe. And then further south of that, that's where you have the Calusa over there in Southwest Florida. And so there were, that's a good question. It's a good thing to talk about, right? So this map over here shows the Timucua, right? Because it's specifically meant to show the Timucua territory. But that's not to say that there wasn't other tribes around, right? There were tribes littered throughout the state of Florida. There were tons of different little groups. The way that this occurred naturally over thousands of years is pretty much you would have a tribe, right? And this tribe in this little village would have a certain number of people, maybe a couple dozen, maybe a couple hundred, and it would start growing naturally. Populations grow, and it would grow, and it would grow, and after a few generations, eventually it might grow too big, and so you'd have like one branch of this tribe would maybe go elsewhere, seek more I don't want to say fertile lands, because it was all pretty much reliant on the abundance of life everywhere. But if this land was getting a little bit too crowded, they would go elsewhere and start up their little tribe over there. And after a few generations, the tribes would be distinct from one another, right? So that kind of happened throughout all the state. And so you have lots of these tribes, or these villages that are very small. Lots of them were only a couple thousand. A few of them were a bit bigger, like the Calusa and Tocobagua, and some of the Timucua clans were a bit larger and had maybe tens of thousands. But it's difficult to say specific like territories, right? It's hard to really map it out because they didn't really use maps, and so that's more of a modern thing to show the area that we're talking about, right? Because if I just say Timucua, what am I talking about? North Florida? Am I talking about South Florida? What am I talking about? So this is just to show the Timucua, but yes, there were many tribes throughout the state. Some were just a few hundred, others were maybe tens of thousands. And so that Gulf area right there, right around where the Panhandle meets the peninsula, that I believe was the Tocobaga. And then if you go further south into that, where like Tampa is, and even down to the Everglades, you have the Calusa. Calusa were actually one of the biggest tribes in Florida. We know that a bunch of tribes down in South Florida paid tribute to them. They were very dominant down there. They're actually the ones that killed Juan Ponce de Leon. They shot him in the leg with a poisoned arrow. So that's a fun fact there. So the Timucua is just the name for various of these groups that. Yeah, so like even though you just look at the map and you see this whole area belong to the Timucua, really like the freshwater village was, you know, a small little area over here by the water, and then the saltwater village was just a small little area over there, and you know they might have hated each other's guts, and there would be the Acuero people over by the St. John's River and the Potano people, and you know they were mostly independent from each other, and they had their slight differences. So it'd be weird to, like, if you go back in time 500 years and go talk to somebody from the Acuero tribe and you're like, hey, what's up, my Timucuan? Like they would have no idea what the heck you're talking about, because that's not how they saw themselves in their little specific villages and smaller tribes, not as a whole thing. Which is actually a thing that happens a lot in American history or Native American history. If you look at a lot of these outside of Florida, there's a lot of these different like confederations and stuff that happened in the 1800s as some of these groups banded together to try and resist the Western powers and stuff. And so I think some of that like knowledge gets applied to these Florida groups, right? They're like, oh, it's the Timucua Federation, right? The same way that some of these groups up north, like the Iroquois, you know, banded together. Sure, certainly they must have banded together in Florida. So, you know, whether we do it on purpose or just that's how we think of them, I think some of that gets applied to some of these Florida groups, and they just kind of get lumped together into a group. So I hope that answered some of your questions and beyond. All right.
Yeah. You guys good? Well, Felipe, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge about the Native people of Florida. It's very interesting history, and I don't think a lot of us know a lot about the Timucuans. We know a little more about the Seminoles, or we think we do. But anyway, it's good. And come see us sometime, and we'll expound on this.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you again for the very last minute technical adjustments. You know, instead of just canceling, at least, you know, people were able to learn a little bit. So thanks again for making it possible. And I hope to go there one day in the future and give it in person. And
okay, we'll hold you to that.
Okay.
Thank you. Everybody have a good night.
Bye. Thank you very much. Take care.